This talk is titled, How Would Moral Bioenhancement Impact Children of Color? I wanted to give a quick disclaimer. I plan to get somewhat personal in this talk. Sorry for that, but I think we've established through our previous sessions that storytelling is one of the best ways to get a point across. It's a better mode of rhetoric than just sharing data, unless it's excellent, like narrative data. Thank you, Kate. But also, thanks for inviting me. Thanks to the organizers of this conference, this excellent conference, for inviting me and taking a chance on this kind of project. A few words about the origins of this project. In the middle of my graduate training, I'm trained as a philosopher here at the University of Washington and previously at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And at one of the big neuroethics conferences, there was an all-white panel on moral enhancement to reduce recidivism rates and reoffense rates for people in prison. And it took every ounce of courage to get up and ask a question about the possibility of using interventions, neurointerventions, on prisoners who are Black and Hispanic by overrepresentation. And their response to me was, we control for race in our studies. And that was a very disappointing response. And so this entire project is my attempt to make sense of this possibility that we can use neurotechnologies to make people better in the context of racial and social inequity in general. Here's an agenda to get us going. I'm going to evaluate this potential call for moral bioenhancement. I'm going to suggest that many of us are already unwitting participants, perhaps, in moral bioenhancement projects and moral enhancement projects more generally. I am also going to assert that moral bioenhancement projects would likely target Black people. If we are taking on as a project technologies to make people better people, who would be targeted by those people who we think are not making the mark. And Black people often fit that bill as far as the public consciousness is concerned. I argue that moral bioenhancement would likely undermine Black resilience to racism, so the specific ways in which moral enhancements and moral bioenhancements are being proposed to improve moral behavior in people generally would undermine specific techniques and behaviors that Black people use to defend themselves. I'll end the talk by saying that we should place constraints on moral bioenhancement. So let's talk about the call. So Ingmar Persson and Julian Savulescu have made this argument that our capacity to harm is unprecedented, meaning we have the technology, the techniques, and the potential to cause global and ultimate harm. This is not hard to imagine. The possibility that we might destroy ourselves through the use of nuclear and biological weapons, through the use of technologies that cause disastrous changes to our climate, our inability to create policies and technologies that undo those kinds of harms. And our moral capacities do not match up with our technical capacities at all. We are inadequate to the task of handling these global problems. We're slow to act, and we are slow to empathize with others outside of our local context. And so that means that we are even more likely to cause these harms downstream. And so we have to investigate, they argue, the possibility of moral enhancement by means of genetic and biomedical techniques to minimize or prevent these global harms. But it's not exactly clear what technologies we would use for the sake of moral bioenhancement. But most recently, the moral bioenhancements proposed are neurointerventions that augment neural circuitry responsible for moral decision-making and behavior. So we're thinking about interventions like the use of oxytocin through nasal swabs, propranolol as a way of reducing fear responses, transcranial magnetic and direct current stimulation, which are often used for the treatment of different mental health conditions, in this case would be used off-label for the sake of reducing certain forms of moral behavior, or rather behaviors related to moral decision-making, namely anger responses and fear responses. These interventions could also dampen the neural circuitry responsible for fear or anger, and that could also thwart moral decision-making. And so we've seen this in the literature over the course of the last decade and a half, the idea that oxytocin is a moral molecule that can increase compassion for your neighbors and people abroad, increasing trust, increasing ability to share one's emotions. And proponents of moral bioenhancement will argue that this kind of behavior is conducive to good moral decision-making, because if we can trust one another, then maybe we can trust we can trust them to look out for our best interests. And if we can trust one another to look out for our best interests, then maybe we will actually look out for our one another's best interests. I'm extremely skeptical. You're skeptical, right? Yes, we're skeptical. Everybody's skeptical. So Dublevic and Racine, two colleagues of mine, I love them, they're great. They argue that these neuro interventions often turn out to not impact moral reasoning. More often than not, they impact moral reasoning in a negative way, in a counterintuitive way, but only counterintuitive from a certain perspective. In the case of oxytocin, and I just want to read their words here, it can be seen more as a nepotism enhancer, since it increases cooperation with out-group members of society, for instance, racial minorities, put a pin in that for later, and selectively promotes ethnocentrism, favoritism, parochialism, and even preemptive aggression toward the out-group. Oxytocin, in the literature and abroad, at least in the sympathetic literature and in the public media, up until recently, is heralded as a kind of moral molecule. As it turns out, it's anything but. It's just a molecule with very complicated impacts on the people who use it for things that it's not being used for. In the case of neurostimulation, so transcranial magnetic and direct current stimulation, they write, it's safe to assume that the current state of evidence for TDCS as a moral enhancer is similar to that of TMS. Its effects are far from being effective, as interventions seem to promote selfish behavior instead of moral conduct. So this is not looking good for moral enhancement. But honestly, I really don't care. Really what I care about is the following. Whose fear, anger, and rage are appropriate? I put these two images next to one another for obvious reasons if you've been paying attention for the last 5 years. So on the left, we have a Black Lives Matter protest. We've been having them for 10 years. We've been having them since Trayvon Martin was shot down for walking in a neighborhood where he didn't supposedly belong. But on the right, we have the January 6th insurrection that happened last year. I'm calling on us to be very careful about how we evaluate these two different expressions of anger. And I'm calling us to be especially careful about how we evaluate other people's evaluations of anger, right? So we might think it's a harmless debate to ascertain whether or not a protest is a valid form of political resistance or a valid form of expressions of speech. Even in the cases where we have protesters that are not acting out of violence, protesters who have stayed peaceful, Black Lives Matter has come under scrutiny for the things that a lot of people that we in Seattle call NIMBYs often complain about. They're disrupting the flow of traffic on the 5 freeway. They're disrupting the functioning of businesses downtown, so on and so forth. Oftentimes, people will evaluate these two contexts similarly, where in the case of the January 6th insurrection, People are even sympathetic of what happened that day. Some people have characterized what happened as a valid form of political resistance, as a kind of reckoning that was long overdue. The fact that we can use the same language for both, frankly, sickens me. My big worry here is that the disenfranchisement of Blacks and Latin Americans in the U.S. Can be justified, just the same way that we can justify the actions that happened at this nation's capital last year. We can justify the mistreatment of Black people and Latin American people in this country through the treatment of mental illness. Jonathan Metzl and Will Larson have both argued that the diagnosis of schizophrenia in Black men is a holdover from the civil rights movement, where Black men were characterized as having a mental disorder that made them more prone to expressions of anger. And one expression of that anger is the protest, is the political resistance of the 60s. We justify the disenfranchisement of people of color as the correction of misbehavior in schools. This is where I get personal. I was subject to this kind of disenfranchisement, this kind of correction. My whole family was. I have a brother in prison. He's currently in prison. He started off in the juvenile detention system as a result of claims made about him in elementary school. But Kimberly Crenshaw and Nancy Nyquist Potter have picked up this critique in particular, and we'll talk about it in a few slides. Disenfranchisement can be justified as a kind of egalitarian response to criminal behavior. This is a dovetailing of the previous point, that misbehavior is a prelude to criminal behavior. And this establishes what has been called the school-to-prison pipeline. Keep this in mind. In the name of future medical care, I don't know how complete your education about this was, but I know in my undergraduate years, no one told me the specifics of Tuskegee, the justification for it, the mischaracterization of Black people as sexually promiscuous, as in need of protection from themselves, postbellum. And also, and I won't say much about this, but as standing up for good taste and respect. One of my favorite philosophers of art has argued that Black art is demonized because it's seen as vulgar, and Black behavior is seen as vulgar. Also keep this in mind, even though I don't have time to talk about it today. I want to say that all of these disenfranchisements were and are conceived as moral bioenhancement projects, or moral enhancement projects in general. The attempt to correct the supposed poor moral behavior of people of color is a moral enhancement project. The attempt to correct moral behavior by pharmaceutical means is a moral bioenhancement project. And both of these types of projects have targeted people of color in fatal ways. I'm arguing that there is an overlap between our previous moral enhancement projects and our current proposed moral bioenhancement projects. Just because the technologies change doesn't mean the valence has changed. So we have to ask ourselves, can we trust ourselves to know which traits are virtuous and which are vicious? Can we trust ourselves to identify the appropriate targets for moral enhancement? No, we can't even tell the difference between Black Lives Matter and the January 6th. How can we say that we have that capacity? We don't. I see all of you are with me. Can we ensure that enhancements won't leave marginalized people vulnerable? And this is really what I think is my contribution to this literature, that moral enhancements and the new proposed moral bioenhancements will leave people of color vulnerable. And so, of course, a lot of you seem to agree, by straw poll of heads shaking, the answer to these questions for the most part is no. And we can find evidence for this in how children of color are treated. There's the pediatric part. It's minimally pediatric, I'm sorry. But you invited me. So, we fail black girls in schools. So, I want to read this scenario from Jyotinanda's Blind Discretion, a great legal paper that she released a while back. Sarah is a 15-year-old female student of color who is several years behind her peers in school and does not like school much. She has a learning, social, or emotional issue that has never been diagnosed. These issues arise at school and at home, with her family and sometimes among her peers. She has some abuse or violence in her home, and she was involved in an abusive dating relationship. Sarah lives in a poor neighborhood with schools that are overcrowded and under-resourced. When she is repeatedly late to school, she is expelled. We'll see later that Sarah is much more likely than her brother James to be expelled. But let's put that aside for now. Hanging out on the street one night past curfew, she's arrested and enters the juvenile justice system. Sarah is a typical girl who enters the juvenile justice system, and once she's in, she's never really out. I can't tell you how many people I know who are just like Sarah. From another paper, to get into some of the details, black girls are much, in the US at least, are often much more likely to be disciplined in school than white girls and even black boys. Black boys, as it turns out, are expected to do bad things and so are excused for them a little bit more often. Police presence is often ubiquitous in lower income schools. More severe action often results in police intervention and juvenile detention. Black girls may just avoid school to avoid what they perceive as a chaotic, unsafe environment. And wouldn't you if you were being targeted? Again, this is an enhancement project. It's meant to discipline girls, black girls. In Kimberly Crenshaw's great piece, Black Girls Matter, she gives a number of statistics. Most of them focus on school districts in the U.S. and also school districts, the school districts in New York and Boston. They found that black boys are suspended 3 times more than white boys, but black girls are suspended 6 times more than white girls. They also found that that black girls are disciplined more than everyone else as well. So not just counting expulsions, but all kinds of different kinds of forms of discipline. This holds across the U.S., but is especially prevalent in cities like New York and Boston. I want to break into some data they collected, some narrative data that gives you a clearer picture of the kinds of denigration they face. Educators lack concern for black girls, and in the words of one person participating in their interview project, you can tell because the teacher who just wants to get paid, if there's something wrong with you, they won't bother asking you if you're okay or if you need anything. Stereotypes of black girls drive how they're treated. So there are these, what Patricia Hill Collins calls driving narratives. So things like they can't be trusted, or they are loud and rowdy, ghetto, stuff like that, ignorant. Police interventions in schools are dehumanizing, you basically got to come to school naked. It's like uncomfortable. They got to search you. It feels like you're in jail. It's like they treat you like animals because they think that's where you're going to end up. This gives me a lot of bad memories. There was once a time in middle school when I was asked to write standards. How many of you remember standards? Nobody had to write standards? So this is when you write some phrase 100 times as a disciplinary measure. And what did my junior high science teacher have me write? He had me write, I will become a bum on the street living in a cardboard condominium. This happened. I can't find him to send him the angry email, but but this happened. It happened to a lot of my friends, and it's not an uncommon thing to have happened in the 90s in Los Angeles. And it wasn't a coincidence that the same school that had this teacher had, regular police intervention. Let's jump into some resources that can help us understand more about this. So Nancy Nyquist Potter argues that Black children are often mis- or overdiagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder. One example that I thought that she gives that I thought was poignant is that there's a childhood onset of callous, unemotional personality dimension in Black children. And that often makes it more likely that they will be diagnosed with conduct disorder. But she and several others asked the question, well, how should Black children act when they are disenfranchised? So, for example, if a person is being given a test that involves violence, but a Black child is less likely to respond with fear or worry to that scenario of violence, they might be thought of as a person with conduct disorder, especially if they're lashing out because of the violence that they have to see every day. Potter argues that deeper cultural analyses should inform diagnoses of ODD and CD, of aggression, the concept of aggression, and the concept of anger in general. Classifications like oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder reinforce themselves in a way and are reinforced by stereotypes. So if somebody tries to escape that classification, they might seem more aggressive. They might seem more angry. This was certainly the case for me. And the attempt to urge Black children to avoid defiant, disruptive, or aggressive behavior have resulted in docility in the face of injustice. And an anthropologist, Morris, Nancy Potter cites as having done interviews with girls at historically Black colleges and universities who were given special interventions to curb their quote-unquote aggressive or defiant behavior. It turns out that they were not able to push back on instances of sexism and racism in their college experience, and so performed much more poorly compared to their peers who hadn't gone through those behavioral interventions. Sometimes defiance is a virtue, especially when it has an appropriate target and goal. In this case, racism and sexism. Another resource we could look to, and this is setting it up for Claire Shearer tomorrow, who's giving a great talk on epistemic violence in the pediatric ER. Claire, if you're out there, hello. There you are. Christy Dotson, the philosopher Christy Dotson, gives us the concept of epistemic violence. This is this is a form of violence that relates to knowledge and its preconditions, its production, its bearers, who counts as a knower and who doesn't count as a knower. So epistemic violence occurs when an audience refuses to reciprocate a linguistic exchange because of harmful forms of ignorance. You dismiss me because you think that I am not an adequate knower, because of some stereotype you might have of me or some previous experience you might have of people like me. There are two forms of this she gives us. Testimonial quieting. This is when the audience fails to identify a speaker as a knower, and then the speaker needs an audience to identify or at least recognize her as a knower for her to offer testimony. And so So a knower is quieted when they are dismissed as a knower. Testimonial smothering is when you do that preemptively. Instead of other people dismissing you, you dismiss yourself. You keep yourself under wraps. This is exactly what is happening in those cases where behavioral interventions are making it harder for people to push back. Anger is valuable. To take from Audre Lorde, the great Audre Lorde's The Uses of Anger in her Sister Outsider, and I'm just going to read this, and I'm getting close to the end, so I think I'll take the liberty. My response to racism is anger. I have lived with that anger, ignoring it, feeding upon it, learning to use it before it laid my visions to waste for most of my life. Once I did it in silence, afraid of the weight. My fear of anger taught me nothing. Your fear of that anger will teach you nothing also. This is epistemic violence, illustrated in poetic fashion. Anger expressed and translated into action in the service of our vision and our future is a liberating and strengthening act of clarification, for it is the painful process of this translation that we identify who are our allies with whom we have grave differences, and who are our genuine enemies. So anger can be a way of distinguishing between your allies and enemies. It can be a way of understanding why you're angry, what's making you mad, and what to do about it. This is extremely valuable. Maisha Cherry calls this Lordian rage, and she argues that arguments against, defends it against arguments that anger thwarts other emotions necessary to good moral decision-making. She argues we need our anger, especially as people of color. Lordian rage, she argues, targets racism, drives anti-racism, bolsters solidarity. To quote Audre Lorde again, I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. Lordian rage promotes survival or even flourishing. I say eventually or hopefully because it's difficult to survive through the force of rage alone. But that's what a lot of us are doing. This is what Lisa Tessman calls a burdened virtue. And so to close out, should we follow through on moral bioenhancement projects? No, not without constraints at least. I propose these constraints. We ought not support or continue moral bioenhancement projects that misrecognize or erase the agency of unjustly disenfranchised, marginalized, or oppressed groups. We ought not support projects that undermine the ability of those groups to resist oppression, as we've seen before in the previous cases. And we ought not support projects, moral bioenhancement projects, without exhausting the possibilities of moral education and cooperation. And in the context of mental health care in communities of color, especially within schools, we have not done that at all. That's it.